The Switch library is massive, and a lot of genuinely good games get buried under the big first-party releases. This list is 25 games worth digging out of the eShop, just the ones that earned a spot through story and mechanics. CrossCode is an action RPG built inside a fictional MMO, which sounds gimmicky, but actually gives the story room to do something clever with amnesia and identity without leaning on cutscenes for exposition. You play Lee, a player character who can't talk, exploring a sci-fi world through dungeons and an overworld full of platforming puzzles. Combat runs on a ball-based ranged attack system, so instead of swinging a sword, you're aiming, bouncing shots off walls, and managing elemental types like a Zelda dungeon crossed with a bullet hell shooter. The puzzle design is where it really stands out, with physics-based blocks, timing gates, and momentum tricks that get genuinely tough by the back half. It's a long game, 25+ hours, and it never really pads itself out. If you liked old-school Zelda dungeons but wanted faster combat, this is the one people keep quietly recommending. Pipistrello and the Cursed Yoyo, a Metroidvania where your only weapon is a yo-yo, and that single gimmick carries way more weight than it should. You're Pipit, a bat trying to become a yo-yo champion, and his wealthy aunt gets zapped by local crime bosses and ends up trapped inside his yo-yo. So the story is basically a family rescue plot dressed up as a turf war across 4 city districts. Each district ends in a boss who drops a new yo-yo trick, and those tricks double as traversal tools and puzzle keys, similar to how Metroid handles item gating. There's also a pinball layer to combat, where you bounce the yo-yo off bumpers to clear out rooms full of enemies. It's a longer game than it looks, 15 to 20 hours if you're chasing collectibles, and the writing between Pipit and his aunt carries more charm than you'd expect from something this retro-styled. Shogun Showdown is a turn-based tactics roguelike set in a corrupted feudal Japan, and it barely bothers with story. You're told to kill the Shogun, and that's about it, with any lore coming from enemy flavor text and boss dialogue. What it does instead is put all its effort into the combat loop. You get a row of weapon tiles at the bottom of the screen, and every fight is about positioning yourself and timing attacks against enemies who telegraph their moves one turn ahead. It's closer to a chess puzzle than a typical roguelike brawl, and it rewards reading the board over reacting fast. Runs are short, node-based maps with shops and unlockable characters between attempts, so it's built for repeat runs rather than one long story campaign. If you liked Into the Breach's puzzle-like combat, but wanted something with deck building and unlocks layered on top, this scratches that itch. The Rogue Prince of Persia. This is a roguelite reboot of the Prince of Persia formula, built by the Dead Cells team, and it shows in how tight the movement and combat feel. The story is minimal on purpose. You're a prince stuck in a time loop, trying to stop an invasion, dying and restarting runs while slowly piecing together what's actually going on through NPCs back at your hideout. Mechanically, it's a 2D side-scroller focused on acrobatic platforming and fast melee combat, with wall runs, dashes, and parries chained together the way Dead Cells handled its combat rhythm. Weapons and relics change up your build each run, and the game leans hard into speed, punishing hesitation more than it punishes mistakes. It's still in active development with regular content drops, but even in its current state, it's one of the better roguelite platformers on Switch right now. Katana ZERO is a neo-noir action game, where every level is a one-hit kill puzzle you solve through trial and error, similar in spirit to Hotline Miami, but slower and more deliberate. You play an assassin with the ability to slow time and see brief glimpses of the future, taking contracts from a mysterious voice on a phone, while popping pills that are clearly doing more than just keeping him functional. The story unfolds through therapy sessions between missions, and it gets genuinely dark and ambiguous about memory, trauma, and whether the protagonist can trust what he's being told. On the mechanic side, levels are short, brutal, and built around planning routes through enemies who kill you instantly, with deflecting bullets and reading enemy patterns being the core skill. Death's Door puts you in the role of a crow who works for a bureaucratic agency that collects souls, and your assignment goes sideways when a soul you're supposed to reap gets stolen by another reaper. It's a Souls-like light crossed with a Zelda dungeon structure, so you're clearing linear areas with a boss at the end, picking up new abilities that open up backtracking routes in classic Metroidvania fashion. Combat is stamina light but precision heavy, built around dodge timing and reading boss patterns rather than button mashing, and each of the game's main bosses has a genuinely distinct fight design. The tone is dry and a little melancholic, dealing with death and bureaucracy in a way that's funnier than it sounds without ever getting cutesy about it. It's a shorter game, around 10 to 12 hours, but the pacing is tight enough that it never overstays its welcome. Ninja Gaiden Ragebound is a 2D, side-scrolling action game set during the original Ninja Gaiden NES timeline, following a new ninja named Kenji, who ends up fused with the spirit of a rival clan member after his village is wiped out. That forced partnership is the core hook of both the story and the mechanics. You're playing two characters sharing one body, and combat lets you switch between their movesets and combo styles mid-fight to keep pressure on enemies. It's built on fast, technical swordplay, with wall running and dash mechanics layered in for movement, closer to Ninja Gaiden's classic difficulty than the more forgiving action games that came after it. Boss fights demand pattern recognition and precise punishes, rather than just outlasting enemies with health bars. For a series revival, it leans hard into being genuinely hard rather than nostalgic set dressing, and that's mostly a good thing here. Guacamelee 2 is a Metroidvania built around Mexican folk art and lucha libre wrestling, following Juan, a now-retired luchador pulled back into action to stop a cosmic threat years after the events of the first game. The tone is constantly cracking jokes at itself and at video game tropes in general, but the platforming underneath is legitimately demanding, with wrestling moves doubling as both combat tools and traversal abilities the way Metroid handles item gates. You'll unlock uppercuts, dashes, and dimension-shifting powers that let you swap between the living world and the land of the dead to access new paths, and combat can pull enemies into grapple combos that chain into platforming sections without a pause. Co-op is supported the whole way through if you want to play it with someone else. It's colorful, self-aware, and one of the tighter genre entries that doesn't take 50 hours to finish. Moonlight Peaks is a cozy life sim with a vampire twist, casting you as the child of a Dracula-type patriarch who moves out to prove that a life of compassion is possible, even for the undead. The whole game runs on a flipped clock, with your days starting in the evening and ending before sunrise, and you spend that time farming, building relationships, and slowly uncovering the history of 7 supernatural families that share the town with werewolves, witches, and mermaids. Mechanically, it's Stardew Valley-shaped planting magical crops, upgrading your cottage, running errands for townsfolk, but it layers in spellcasting, potion brewing, and shape-shifting abilities tied to your vampire lineage. There's also a full romance system with a couple dozen dateable characters. It doesn't reinvent the farming sim formula, but the horror cozy tone and nighttime setting give it a distinct identity in a crowded genre. Cuphead is a run-and-gun boss rush built entirely around 1930s rubber hose animation, hand-drawn and painted frame by frame to look like it walked straight out of an old Fleischer cartoon. The story is thin by design. Cuphead and Mugman make a deal with the devil, lose, and now have to collect soul contracts from a roster of bosses to pay off the debt. But it's really just an excuse to string together one of the toughest boss gauntlets on the platform. Nearly every fight is a multi-phase boss, with distinct attack patterns you have to memorize, parry, and dodge around, with very little in the way of regular enemy encounters slowing things down. There's a parry mechanic tied to pink objects that rewards aggressive, precise play, and a co-op mode if you want to split the punishment with a friend. It's unapologetically difficult, but the presentation alone makes it worth the frustration. Animal Well is a Metroidvania that strips away combat almost entirely and replaces it with pure exploration and puzzle logic, putting you in control of a small blob-like creature navigating a cave system full of animals, secrets, and item-based riddles. There's no dialogue and barely any text, so whatever story exists is communicated entirely through environmental clues and the way the map itself is structured, which has led to a genuinely deep community effort to decode what's actually going on. Mechanically, tools like a yo-yo, a disc, and a firecracker aren't used to fight. They're used to manipulate the environment, trigger switches, and solve layered puzzles that often require using two items together in ways the game never explicitly tells you. It's a shorter main campaign, but the amount of hidden content and alternate paths built into the map rewards the kind of obsessive exploration Metroid fans specifically look for. Mio is a Metroidvania set aboard a massive, decaying generation ship called the Vessel, where you play an android waking up with no memory of what she's supposed to do or who she used to be. The story is told almost entirely through environmental detail and sparse dialogue rather than exposition, with the ship's condition and the state of its stranded caretaker robots doing most of the storytelling. Structurally, it follows the genre standard. New abilities open new areas. Health and currency systems tie into optional backtracking. But it's built around a hand-painted, sketch-like art style, where the world literally gets drawn in more detail as your character's awareness grows. Combat is more accessible than genre leaders like Hollow Knight, with adjustable difficulty, while movement includes wall climbing and gliding tools for traversal. The Messenger starts as a straightforward 8-bit action platformer about a ninja delivering a scroll to stop a demon army. Then, about a third of the way in, it pulls a genre swap that turns the whole thing into an open, Metroidvania-style world with 16-bit visuals to match. That shift isn't just cosmetic. The game starts handing you time travel mechanics that let you flip between eras to solve platforming puzzles and reach areas that were previously inaccessible. Combat centers on a cloud step mechanic, where striking an enemy or object mid-air refreshes your jump, encouraging chained aerial combos through spike-filled gauntlets. The writing leans heavily into self-aware humor, poking fun at video game tropes through a shopkeeper character who breaks the fourth wall constantly. It's a game that plays it straight for a while, specifically so the twist lands harder, and it mostly succeeds. Axiom Verge 2 drops the retro, 8-bit aesthetic of the original for a more painterly, semi-open sci-fi world, following an engineer named Indra who discovers a hidden dimension tied to a mysterious tower and an AI she may have created. The story deals with parallel realities and the consequences of unchecked technology, told with a lot more restraint than the first game's glitch-heavy chaos. Mechanically, it drops guns almost entirely in favor of a drill tool used for both traversal and combat, plus the ability to swap into a second dimension called Breach, where movement and physics work differently, letting you solve puzzles by jumping between the two states. Exploration is genuinely non-linear, with very little hand-holding about where to go next, which some people love and others find disorienting. It's a stranger, more experimental sequel than most expected, and it mostly earns that strangeness. Thronefall strips real-time strategy down to its bare essentials. You're a king on horseback who builds a small kingdom during the day and personally fights alongside your troops to defend it at night. There's barely a story here, just a corrupt rival king sending waves of enemies at your castle. But the mechanics are where it earns its spot. During the day, you're placing houses, farms, walls, and towers with limited gold, balancing economy against defense on maps where building placement is constrained and enemies specifically target your resource buildings. At night, you're controlling your king directly in combat, choosing from different weapons and perks that change how aggressive or defensive your playstyle needs to be. There are only 10 handcrafted maps, each with optional difficulty mutators for replay value, and the whole loop is deliberately uncomplicated. No tech trees, no micromanagement, just build, fight, repeat.
It's a fairly compact experience where beating the main campaign is likely to take you around 8 to 12 hours. You can always replay levels at a higher difficulty to complete quests or to chase the high scores of your friends.
Wargroove is a turn-based tactics game, built as a direct spiritual successor to Advance Wars, with a fantasy setting replacing the military one, but the grid-based unit combat staying largely intact. The campaign follows several factions across a war triggered by an assassination, told through a fairly standard but well-paced fantasy story, with commanders who each bring unique abilities and groove attacks into battle. Mechanically, it's classic rock, paper, scissors unit matchups on a grid, with terrain, unit positioning, and commander abilities all factoring into whether an attack is worth making. It also ships with a surprisingly deep map editor and campaign creation tools, which has kept a small but dedicated community building and sharing custom content long after launch. If Advance Wars scratched an itch that hasn't been fed in years, this is the closest thing to it on Switch. Nine Souls is a Metroidvania built around Taopunk aesthetics, blending Taoist philosophy and mythology with a cyberpunk setting where you play Yi, one of the last surviving members of a nearly extinct race, hunting down the godlike souls who nearly wiped his people out. The story deals with cycles of suffering, artificial existence, and what it means to break free of both, and it takes itself seriously without becoming preachy about it. Combat is the standout mechanic here. It's built almost entirely around parrying, with a deflect system that rewards precise timing over dodging, closer to Sekiro than a typical Metroidvania brawler. Boss fights are genuinely demanding, and built around learning specific parry windows rather than memorizing simple attack patterns. Movement is fast, with a grappling hook and wall running tying exploration together. Firewatch is a first-person narrative game where you play Henry, a man who takes a job as a fire lookout in a Wyoming forest to escape a difficult situation back home, and spends the summer talking over radio to his supervisor Delilah while strange things start happening in the woods around him. There's essentially no combat or traditional mechanics. It's exploration and dialogue choices, with your relationship with Delilah built entirely through conversation options that shape how the story unfolds. The mystery plot, involving surveillance and a missing person, takes a back seat to the character writing, which is genuinely some of the better dialogue work in games from this era. The environment itself, all warm sunset colors and dense pine forest, does a lot of the emotional heavy lifting alongside the voice acting. Absolum is a roguelite beat-em-up from the studio behind Streets of Rage 4, set in the fantasy world of Talum, where a tyrant king named Azra has outlawed magic and enslaved wizards under his regime. You play as one of 4 rebel characters, fighting to take him down, and unusually for the genre, the roguelite structure is actually woven into the story rather than bolted on. Dying and restarting is treated as part of the narrative rather than just a game over screen. Combat mixes heavy, punchy beat-em-up hits with fighting game-level technicality, light and heavy attacks, grabs, and elemental spellcasting abilities called rituals that you collect and combine mid-run. Between attempts, you return to a hub to unlock permanent upgrades and talk to other rebels, slowly filling in the world's backstory. It's dense with secrets and branching paths, and the combat rarely gets stale, even after a dozen runs.
The Sun King who dares stand in your path. According to your favorite playstyle, you can choose to fight as
Ender Magnolia is the follow-up to Ender Lilies, set in a country ravaged by a corrupting substance called the Blight that's turned both people and machines into hostile monsters. You play Lilac, a young girl with the ability to purify corrupted beings called homunculi, and the story is told through a melancholic, watercolor-style world dealing with guilt, decay, and what's left behind after a disaster. Mechanically, it's a Metroidvania where your main combat tool isn't a weapon you swing yourself, but a roster of purified homunculi companions you summon to fight alongside you, each with distinct attack styles you can mix and match depending on the encounter. Exploration follows the usual ability-gated structure, with new movement tools opening previously blocked paths, while boss fights lean on pattern recognition over pure reflexes. Tunic puts you in control of a small fox exploring a Zelda-inspired isometric world, but the actual hook is the in-game instruction manual you find piece by piece, written in a language you can't read that you have to interpret visually to figure out mechanics the game never explains directly. The story is almost entirely wordless, told through environmental ruins and item descriptions that hint at a larger civilization and conflict without ever spelling it out. Combat is a stamina-based system, with dodges, parries, and a shield, closer to a lightweight Souls game than classic Zelda, and it gets legitimately tough in the back half once secret mechanics start layering on top of each other. The manual itself becomes a puzzle-solving tool, encouraging you to cross-reference pages, decode symbols, and eventually uncover a genuinely surprising alternate path through the game. Slay the Spire is the game that basically defined the deck-building roguelike genre as we know it now, putting you in control of one of 4 characters, climbing a cursed spire one floor at a time, building a card deck and relic collection as you go. There's very little story here beyond flavor text and character backstory. The entire game is built around its mechanics, and those mechanics are extremely tight. Every run, you're choosing cards after combat, deciding what synergizes with your existing deck, managing HP that carries between fights with no full heals, and reading enemy intent icons that show exactly what they're about to do next turn. That transparency is what makes the difficulty feel fair, even when a run goes badly. Each of the 4 characters plays completely differently, from poison stacking to strength scaling to orb-based spell loops, which keeps runs from feeling repetitive, even hundreds of hours in. Vampire Survivors doesn't have a story worth mentioning, and it doesn't need one. You pick a character, drop into an arena, and survive escalating waves of enemies for 30 minutes while your character auto-attacks and you pick which weapons and passive items to level up. That's the entire game, and it's become the blueprint for an entire genre of bullet heaven games because the power curve is so well tuned. Early on, you're weak and cautious, dodging around a handful of enemies, and by the end of a run, the screen is a wall of projectiles and evolved weapon combos, clearing out hundreds of enemies at once. Weapon evolutions, unlocked by pairing specific items with passive upgrades, are the main strategic layer, along with picking which stage-specific hazards and secrets to chase. It's cheap, endlessly replayable, and one of the easiest games on this list to lose several hours to without noticing. Sea of Stars. You're following 2 Solstice warriors, Valir and Zale, tasked with stopping an alchemist who creates monstrous beings meant to eventually evolve into a world-ending threat. The story takes some genuinely dark turns partway through that break from the cheerful, pixel art tone it opens with, and it's better for not staying predictable. Combat runs on a timing-based system where landing hits on beat deals bonus damage, and blocking incoming attacks reduces damage taken, layered with an enemy weakness system where hitting the right damage type breaks their next attack entirely. Exploration involves platforming and light puzzle solving between fights, plus a cooking system and a boat you sail between islands. It leans hard into nostalgia, but the combat systems are modern enough that it never feels like just a retread of the games it's inspired by. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is a beat-em-up built to look and feel exactly like the Turtles in Time era of TMNT games, with hand-drawn sprite animation and a soundtrack from the same composer behind the Streets of Rage 4 score. The story is a loving throwback to the 80s cartoon, with Shredder and the Foot Clan running schemes across New York, while the Turtles, Splinter, and April fight through waves of mutant enemies to stop them. Mechanically, it's a straightforward but extremely well-tuned side-scrolling brawler, with each of the 7 playable characters controlling differently, combo strings that reward mixing light and heavy attacks, and a parry system that opens enemies up for bigger damage. Up to 6 players can drop into co-op, and there's an arcade mode alongside a longer story campaign with light RPG progression between levels.
I gotta focus! I gotta focus!
That's 25. If there's a genre or era you want covered next, drop it in the comments. Wishlist the ones that caught your interest. They're all worth the money. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.